The Montana wind cut like a blade through pine and bone, dragging across the open plains with no mercy, no pause. It didn't matter if you were man or mule, winter out here devoured the weak and forgot the rest. Clara Whitlow stood at the edge of a snow-caked cattle yard, wrists shackled to a rotting wagon wheel, belly heavy with the weight of 7 months and a heartbeat that wasn't hers. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow in the cold, and her coat was no match for the wind. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken in days, not since her brother Reuben marched her across the state line like a prisoner, then handed her off like livestock to the first man with enough whiskey breath and bullets on his belt to be interested. "She's quiet," Reuben told the man, now circling her like she was a mare to be bred. "Strong legs, carries low. Baby should be fine." The buyer, a rancher named Dale Kerwin, squinted at her under the brim of a sweat-stained hat. "And she don't run." "She used to," Reuben said with a smirk, but not anymore. At that, something stirred, not in the air but inside her. A jab, then a full-bodied thud against her rib cage. It wasn't a flutter or a roll. It was a demand. Her spine stiffened. Another kick, another jolt from the life within her, like a small fist banging on the inside of a locked door. Clara closed her eyes. "I hear you," she whispered the words, barely a breath. "I swear I won't let them sell you too." The wagon creaked as Dale stepped toward her, chains in hand, ready to haul her to whatever life lay behind his weather-worn boots. Reuben didn't look at her. He didn't even blink. In his hand gleamed a silver Colt .45 payment for his sister's silence, for her womb, for her future. Then it happened. The wagon hit a rut in the frozen ground, just a tremor, a small lurch. But it was enough. Clara twisted hard, shoulder slamming into Dale's gut. The chain scraped against the wagon's hitch and snapped clean. She fell sideways into the snow, belly first, pain shooting through her ribs. But she moved, by God, she moved. "Hey," someone shouted behind her. Footsteps thundered in the snow. But Clara didn't stop. Blood streamed down her shin. Her coat snagged on a branch and tore wide. The cold hit her lungs like fire, but she ran anyway. One hand clutching her belly, the other tearing through brambles. Her vision blurred. Trees became streaks. Her boots filled with ice. She could feel the baby again, steady, urgent, alive. She didn't cry. Crying was for people who had somewhere safe to go. Clara had nothing but snow, wind, and a name that was no longer hers. She passed an old fence post. A pair of crows flapped away lazily, unbothered by her flight. Her heart thundered, but the world narrowed into a single thought: don't stop. Because if she stopped, they would find her. If they found her, they'd take her baby. And if they took her baby, everything left of her would vanish in the white. Twilight pressed in gray and dense. The forest deepened. Her body screamed, her hands bled. Still she pressed forward, mumbling through frozen lips. "I'm here, baby. We're still here." Then her foot caught a root buried in snow. She pitched forward down a steep ravine, tumbling sideways until the world went still. The drift caught her like a pillow made of knives, cold, suffocating, silent. Half her body disappeared beneath it. For a long moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind above. Then a small nudge beneath her ribs, not panic this time, just presence. "I'm still here," it seemed to say. Clara whimpered. "I know," she whispered, eyes closing. "I know." She clawed forward inch by inch, pulling herself across the snow with limbs that barely responded. Her fingers had lost sensation. Her coat was soaked through. Blood painted the snow behind her like a trail for wolves. Then through the trees she saw it. A glow. Flickering. Weak but steady. A cabin. Smoke curled up in the wind, barely visible against the dusky sky. Maybe it was real. Maybe it was the last thing she'd see before the cold took her completely. But Clara didn't care. Whether it was fire or death, she would take either so long as it wasn't a cage. She pressed her palm to her belly. Just a little farther, she whispered, "Mama's not done yet." Behind her, the woods swallowed her trail. Snow fell harder. Reuben's voice was gone. The gun was gone. All that remained was a girl crawling toward warmth, and the child inside her who refused to be born into chains. Elias Boone was halfway through splitting a knot of frozen pine when he heard it, a sound out of place in the forest. Not an animal, not the wind, something human. A dragging breath, a broken rhythm like someone trying not to cry while choking on air. He stilled. The woods had a language, and Elias had lived alone among the trees long enough to understand it. Snow muffled most things, but silence always made room for suffering. He dropped the axe with a thud, his boots crunching over the fresh crust of snow as he moved toward the sound. Years alone had sharpened more than just his aim. They had made him a ghost among trees. He weaved between spruce and fir like smoke eyes, scanning for movement, for blood, for threat. He saw the smear of red first, then a shape barely more than a bundle of cloth curled beneath a fallen log dusted in snow. He approached slowly. The figure didn't stir. Not until he got within a few paces did he see her face, cracked lips, frost rimmed around her lashes, and a belly stretched full beneath layers of torn wool. She wasn't just dying, she was carrying life while doing it. Elias crouched beside her. She flinched as if expecting a blow. "No one's going to hurt you," he muttered, more to the trees than to her. Her mouth parted. A single word, paper thin. "Help!" He didn't answer, just looked at the snow around her already starting to reclaim her body. Her fingers were blue, her boots soaked through. Blood marked her left knee and the corner of her temple. She'd run far and hard and for long enough to lose everything but breath. Behind him, tracks, not hers, deep-set, men, heavy, fresh. They'd come looking. He didn't need to know the reason. If someone left a pregnant woman to die in these woods, their reasons didn't matter. He grabbed pine boughs, dragging them behind him to erase her trail, sweeping over the red streak in the snow, breaking and rearranging branches to distort her path. He worked in silence, quick but thorough. Then in a small hollow behind the log, he laid an old wire trap, not for rabbits. This was the kind of snare that taught men to limp home. When he returned, she hadn't moved. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. Her body was a whisper. He bent down and scooped her up. She was light, too light. Her skin cold as riverstone. "Damn waste," he muttered. "Freezing to death with a baby in your gut. What kind of bastard leaves you out here?" He adjusted her weight, bundling his coat tighter around her. His cabin was less than a mile east, buried in a thicket of evergreens. It wasn't much, but it was warm and it was his, and tonight that would be enough. By the time he pushed the cabin door open with his shoulder, she was barely conscious. He laid her gently on the cot near the stove, moving with practiced precision. First removing her soaked boots, then peeling off the outer layers of ice-caked clothing, replacing them with dry furs and a wool blanket so thick it once served as a tent in the mountains. He didn't ask her name. He didn't need one. Instead, he knelt beside the black iron stove, stoked the coals until orange fingers licked the grates, then fed it more wood until the flames took. The warmth grew slowly, first across the floor, then up the walls. He set her boots near the hearth to dry and rubbed her hands between his rough palms, coaxing blood back into them. Her eyes flickered open. Just once. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away. "I don't take in strays," he said flatly, "but dying in my woods, that'd be a waste of good snow." No answer came, only the soft flutter of her breath. He watched her a while, arms crossed, fire reflecting in his eyes. The stove crackled, the only sound besides the wind moaning beyond the shutters. The storm was coming in stronger now. Branches slapped against the roof. Somewhere in the woods, something howled. He didn't flinch. Instead, he stood and filled the kettle with packed snow, setting it on the stove to melt. Then he moved to the workbench, sharpening his blade with the kind of stillness born from years of living without voices. Across the room, her body had stopped shaking. The girl was a stranger. The child inside her someone else's blood. And still Elias felt something tight coil in his chest. Not affection, not pity, something older. It had been years since he'd made a fire for anyone but himself. Years since the fire meant anything more than staying alive through another cold night. But now... He glanced at her belly. A faint movement beneath the fur, a kick maybe, or a stretch, but alive. He turned back to the stove, watching the fire burn hot and even. This time he'd lit it for someone else, and he'd keep it going no matter what came through that door. Clara Whitlow awoke to the soft hiss of pine wood burning. At first, she thought it was a dream, a memory borrowed from long ago when winters were something to be warmed through, not outrun. The warmth on her skin felt too good to be true, too safe to be real. She blinked against the low light. The ceiling above her was made of rough-hewn beams darkened with time and smoke. A single oil lamp burned on a shelf. The smell of heat, real heat, not the imagined kind, curled around her like a promised wood smoke broth and a trace of something clean like fresh snow on flannel. Her fingers curled instinctively around the fur draped over her. Heavy, worn, real. She shifted, winced. Her back ached. Her knees felt torn. But she was alive, and she was warm. Clara sat up slowly, careful not to jostle her belly. The child shifted, answering her movement with a gentle roll beneath her ribs. "We made it," she whispered, voice hoarse from cold and silence. The cabin was small but orderly, the kind of space built not for comfort but for survival. Still, there were signs of care. A tin kettle steamed on the stove. A stew pot simmered on the side, giving off the scent of elk and sage. Someone had folded a pair of socks beside the cot, thick wool clean. But it wasn't the stew or the fire or the blanket that caught her breath. It was the cradle. Nestled near the hearth, almost like it had always belonged there, sat a small, hand-carved cradle. One leg had clearly been repaired, but it had been done with care. Inside, a quilt, old but beautifully patched, lined its interior. The cradle was angled just so, catching the full warmth of the stove. She stared at it, throat tight. It wasn't new, and it wasn't placed there for her. This was something loved before. Clara's fingers moved to her belly again, protective and unsure. A heartbeat stirred beneath her skin, the only thing she was sure she hadn't lost. A creak from outside made her flinch. Then the door opened and Elias Boone stepped in, arms loaded with firewood. He didn't look surprised to see her sitting up. He just nodded once like she'd passed a test. "You're awake," he said. Clara nodded. Her throat burned too much for more. Elias kicked snow off his boots and stacked the wood near the stove. His shirt was patched at the elbow, his hands red from the cold. He moved with the same silence as the woods he came from. Not shy, just stripped of anything unnecessary. She cleared her throat. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't owe me thanks," he replied, hanging his coat by the door. "You needed heat, that's all." But it wasn't just heat, and they both knew it. He ladled stew into a tin bowl and handed it to her. When she reached for the heavier one, he shook his head. "Use the blue one," he said, "lighter, easier to hold." Clara hesitated, then switched bowls. She took a small bite, then another. The flavor was simple but deep. Elk potatoes, some dried thyme maybe. It tasted like something meant to last, like something made by someone who didn't expect company, but made enough just in case. "You thought of everything," she said softly. He grunted. "The stove creaks when it gets too low. Keep an eye on it." He didn't sit. Instead, he moved through the cabin like a man built from muscle memory. He adjusted the shutters, rechecked the firewood. When the kettle began to rattle, he poured hot water into a mug and added a pinch of dried herbs from a jar labeled Maud's Mix. She recognized chamomile and maybe willow bark. Healing tea. For pain, for sleep. Clara sipped it slowly. Across the room, his eyes watched, never hovering but always aware. Her gaze drifted back to the cradle. "That was your daughter's," she said, not a question. Elias's hands stilled. He nodded once. "She's not here anymore." "No," he said, voice flat. "She was long ago." A silence fell. Not the uncomfortable kind, just one wide enough to let grief pass through. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. He didn't answer, but he placed another log on the fire, and when he turned, there was something softer in the set of his shoulders. Later that evening, Clara ran her hand along the edge of the cradle. The carvings were rough but deliberate. Wildflowers. Mountain blooms, the kind that only grew near meltwater. She remembered picking them with her mother once in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. "She'd want my daughter to see those," she murmured. Elias didn't respond, not with words. But that night he left a small, folded note on the table by her tea. "Don't lift anything heavy. Your belly's big as a rain barrel. Below that, a clumsily drawn flower." She smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was the first thing in weeks that hadn't been cruel. In the days that followed, a quiet rhythm emerged. Clara learned the floor creaked near the stove and that Elias never salted the stew until the end. She learned he sharpened every blade by hand and checked the roof after every windstorm. And she learned that when he left her a note, he always ended it with something practical. "Don't forget to eat. Leave the window cracked for the chimney. Never a goodbye. Just instructions to survive." She tried to thank him again once. He waved it off. "I don't like owing people," she said. "I'm not people," he muttered. But each day he made her tea without asking. Each night he stoked the fire higher than he needed. And each time the wind howled against the cabin, Elias stood a little closer to the door. The first sign something was wrong came with the silence. Not the soft hush of snowfall or the quiet that settled when dusk came early. This silence had weight. Clara felt it in the shift of the wind and the way the trees stiffened outside the cabin windows. The dogs sensed it too. They growled low, uneasy. One sat upright by the door and didn't move. Elias was already at the window, eyes fixed on the tree line. Clara set her sewing down, heart thudding against her ribs. The baby stirred low in her belly, restless, uncertain. She didn't need to ask. She already knew. "They're coming," she said. Elias didn't nod, didn't speak. Just turned from the window, crossed the room and opened the hidden panel behind the pantry. It was a crawl space barely tall enough to sit in, carved into the back wall when the cabin was first built long before Clara arrived. "In here," he said, voice like gravel. "Take the blanket. Stay low." She obeyed without question, pressing her body into the tight space despite the strain it put on her swollen belly. Elias's hand brushed her arm, quick, steady. "No matter what you hear," he added, "don't move." Then he shut the panel and the darkness closed around her. Moments later, boots crunched outside. The door creaked open. Cold spilled into the cabin. Voices followed, clipped sharp. "We're looking for a girl," one man said. "Late 20s. Pregnant. Pale skin. Might have come this way." "I don't keep company," Elias replied. His tone was flat, unreadable. "And if I did, she wouldn't be yours to find. We're being paid to return her," the man said. "Family business." From her hiding place, Clara felt her throat tighten. Family, they'd said, the same blood that had left her tied to a wagon like livestock. "You can look around if you like." Elias said after a long pause. But if you step further, you'd best be sure, another voice cut in lower, more cautious. He's got an axe by the stove, looks like it's been used recently. I use it to split wood, Elias said, and though she couldn't see him, Clara could hear the way his weight shifted, the way a man does when he's ready for more than just chopping. Footsteps faltered. Not worth it, the second man muttered. Storm's coming. Silence hung taut as a rope. Then the door groaned shut, more footsteps. Then none. Clara waited. 10 full minutes passed before the panel creaked open. They're gone, Elias said, his face tense, his jaw a line of stone. For now. Clara crawled out, shaking. Her arms trembled beneath her. They'll come back, she said. Yes, and they won't come with questions next time. Her voice cracked. So what do? We move. She looked up, startled. Move, I know someone. An old healer out past the river. Doesn't answer to anyone. She owes me nothing, which means she won't lie to me or about you. Clara nodded, though a sharp pain rippled up her side. When she asked, Elias's eyes moved to the window. Before the next snow. Before the wrong men find the right door. He moved fast. Rope, blankets, food wrapped in waxed cloth, a small leather pouch of coins barely touched in years, a saddlebag long unused. He packed with the urgency of a man who'd stopped waiting for trouble and started running ahead of it. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly as he fastened the straps. Elias paused, the question hanging like frost in the air. Then he looked at her and the words came slow like wood smoke rising from a stubborn fire. Because I've let too many things die in the cold, I won't let it happen again. They left before sunrise. Clara couldn't walk far. The baby was riding low, every movement pressed against her spine like a storm building from within. Elias wrapped her in furs and lifted her onto the back of a small sled tied behind his horse. He made a bed of straw and wool, tucked her in as if she were glass and the world was made of hands too rough to touch her. She didn't ask where they were going. She trusted his silence more than she had ever trusted someone's promises. Snow fell steadily as they moved through the woods, Elias leading the horse on foot, watching for signs, listening for hoofbeats not his own. They passed frozen creeks and sleeping ridgelines, and by the time the sun passed its peak behind gray clouds, Clara's body was racked with pain. She didn't cry, but Elias noticed. We're close, he said, gripping her hand once before returning to the reins. By dusk, a plume of smoke curved into the sky beyond a bend in the river. A small cottage appeared half hidden among willow trees. The door creaked open before they knocked. An old woman stood framed in the light, wrapped in a wool shawl the color of stone. Her eyes were sharp as broken glass, but her voice held no surprise. You brought the storm, she said to Elias. He nodded. And the fire I need to keep lit. The woman's gaze flicked to Clara, assessing her in a single blink. You didn't cause her pain, she said, but you carry it with you. Clara's knees buckled as another wave of pain hit. The woman caught her by the elbow. Inside, now. Chapter. That night, the wind howled like a creature undone. Inside the small house, Clara labored by firelight, sweat slick on her skin. Hands gripping the edge of a worn blanket. The old woman moved with calm certainty, whispering in a tongue Clara didn't understand. Elias stood nearby, face pale, fists clenched. He didn't speak until she cried out his name. I don't know what to do, he whispered, knees hitting the floor beside her. You don't have to know, the woman said. You just have to stay. And he did. He held her hand as if it could tether her to this world. He pressed a damp cloth to her forehead. When she said it hurts, he said, give it to me. And when she said I can't, he said, then I'll carry it. And then as thunder cracked above the mountains and firelight flickered against the cradle waiting in the corner, a cry filled the room, sharp, clear, furious with life. A daughter. Elias didn't speak, just stood stunned as Clara pressed the baby against her chest. "She's here," Clara whispered, "because you kept the fire burning." Elias looked down at the child, then back at Clara. "You kept me burning too." By the time the snow began to melt, the cabin no longer felt like a hiding place. It had changed subtly, like winter easing into spring, not with thunder but with persistence. The air was warmer, but not just from the fire. The shadows stretched differently. Light came in through a new window Elias had cut with his own hands, letting the sun touch parts of the floor that had known only cold before. Clara had dried herbs hanging above the stove now, sage, wild mint, red cedar bark. Some she used for tea, others for lullabies. The scent gave the space something sacred. The cradle Elias built sat close to the fire, smoother than the first. He had carved wildflowers along its edges, not perfect but steady, the kind of blooms that grew along rivers, stubborn and low to the ground. Clara had named the baby Rosalie. Sometimes rose when her voice softened with joy. She sang to her often, not nursery rhymes but half-remembered songs from childhood, songs her mother used to hum before everything cracked open. At first her voice trembled, unfamiliar with tenderness. But the baby didn't mind, and so the song stayed. Elias didn't sing, but he listened. That was enough. He'd built a new table too. Nothing fancy, just planks, plain smooth legs joined by iron nails. It bore the marks of real-life spoon notches, scorch spots from a kettle set down too hot, and a dent where Clara had dropped a tin cup and laughed until her eyes welled. He still woke before dawn, still chopped wood in silence. But now, beside the axe on its rack, there was a small pile of whittled animals. A fox with 2 large ears, a bear cub, a lopsided pony. Toys for Rosalie made from the same hands that once built only for survival. Clara watched him often, not out of wariness anymore, but wonder. The way he moved had changed. He still said little, but his silence wasn't sharp now. It had softened into something comforting, the kind of quiet you wanted to fall asleep next to. They didn't speak of the night Rosalie was born. Not with words, but they carried it with them in glances, in the way Clara handed him the baby. When his hands trembled from memory, in the way he kissed Rosalie's forehead, when he thought Clara wasn't looking. Sometimes when the baby cried at night, Elias was the one who rose first. One morning, Clara found him asleep in the rocking chair, the baby tucked against his chest, her tiny hand gripping his shirt. He didn't stir when Clara placed a blanket over them. He just breathed deeper, one arm tightening around the child like she was the most natural thing he'd ever held. A letter arrived from the nearby settlement. Elias barely read it before handing it over. "They're holding a spring gathering," Clara said. "A fire circle music storytelling. They're inviting everyone from the valley." He shrugged. "We're not much for crowds." She smiled. "Maybe not, but she might be." So they went. Rosalie was wrapped in a woven sling across Clara's chest. Elias wore a clean shirt, stiff from disuse, and boots that had been oiled just that morning. The walk wasn't long, but the moment they stepped into the ring of firelight, surrounded by neighbors, the first faces they'd seen in months, Clara felt her heart stutter. There were children running through the grass, elders seated on logs telling stories as old as the hills. Music rose from a fiddle played by a man with eyes like winter bark. Someone passed around stew in cracked wooden bowls. Someone else handed Clara a shawl woven with pine needle patterns. For once, no one asked where she came from. When a woman with gray hair and sun-drenched cheeks invited Clara to speak, Elias tensed. But Clara stood. She stepped into the circle firelight, glinting off the tiny beads sewn into her sleeves. Rosalie stirred, then settled against her heart. "My name is Clara Whitlow," she began. Her voice was steady, though her hands weren't. "I was sold once, by someone who shared my blood. I was chained, silent, and forgotten. I didn't run because I was brave. I ran because the baby inside me kicked so hard I thought she was begging me to survive. A few murmurs, a shift in the crowd. I wasn't saved by a hero," she went on. "There was no white horse, no promise of love, just a man who lit a fire and kept it going. He left stew on the stove and a note on the table that said my belly was big as a grain barrel." Laughter rippled. He didn't ask questions. He just made room. He sharpened my knife, replaced the broken door hinge, and stood in front of men who wanted to drag me back into a life I didn't choose. She looked across the circle, found Elias at its edge, hat in hand, eyes down. He didn't say I was safe, he made it true. The crowd hushed. Then Elias stepped forward slowly. From his coat pocket he pulled a small wooden blade carved with care edges smooth as river stone. He knelt beside Rosalie and placed it in her hand. One word was carved into the hilt, hope. "She'll outgrow it," Elias said, voice rough, "but she'll remember it was sharp once." That night, back at the cabin, Clara rocked Rosalie by the fire while Elias carved another shape from pine. When she asked what it would be, he said only, "Something for her to carry when she walks," and Clara, for the first time in her life, believed her daughter would grow up not with fear but with something far rarer. A home carved by love and guarded by silence that had finally learned to speak. The snow came again, but this time it didn't bring fear. It fell softly without rush, layering the cabin roof in white, while inside the warmth held. The fire burned low and steady in the stove, casting gold across the worn floorboards. Shadows moved gently on the walls, not from danger but from life. Clara sat near the hearth, Rosalie cradled in her arms, humming a lullaby passed down from a mother who hadn't known how to stay. Her voice had changed since winter, fuller, more certain. She no longer sang to remember. She sang to root herself here in this place where she had not been bought or broken but found and chosen. Elias sat across from her, a block of pine in one hand, carving knife in the other. His brows were furrowed in focus, but his shoulders were relaxed. The figure taking shape beneath his blade looked like a bear, not quite right, but unmistakably meant to be held. Like everything he made, it wasn't polished, but it was built to last. He'd patched the roof last week, replaced the fence behind the woodshed, even built a second cradle, not because they needed one, but because Clara said Rosalie might want to rock her dolls someday. These were the things no one talked about in stories, the quiet dailiness of love, the small acts that meant everything. Outside, the world kept on being hard. Letters still came from the town with news of men looking for women who had run. Sometimes Elias would scan them, then throw them into the fire without a word. Clara never asked what they said. She didn't need to. The door had a new lock. The rifle stayed oiled. But more than that, Elias stayed every morning, every night. And Clara did too. She never dreamed of palaces. She didn't need grand weddings or names carved in stone. She only needed this, a baby breathing against her chest, a man building a toy by firelight, and the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but earned. Sometimes at night she lay awake listening to the wind move through the pines and thought about how easily things could have ended. If the wagon hadn't hit that stump, if her legs hadn't held, if Elias hadn't lit the fire. But he had. And because of that, she hadn't just survived, she had started again. Spring pressed on the horizon now. The thaw was coming. Soon the rivers would run again, the birds would return, and the earth would remember how to bloom. But tonight they were still, together. Rosalie stirred fists tight in sleep. Clara pressed her lips to the baby's head, breathing in the sweet scent of skin and wool and ash. She looked over at Elias, who had set his carving down and was now watching her, not with longing, not with fear, but with something deeper. Like he couldn't believe he got to stay. "You kept the fire for me," she said, her voice barely more than breath. He nodded once. She smiled. "Now let's keep it for her." He didn't reply. He just leaned over, stoked the embers once more, and laid another log on the flame, the same way he had done since the night she came in from the cold. And so the fire stayed lit, not because they needed it to survive, but because it had become something more than warmth. It had become home. Sometimes the people we need most don't arrive with grand speeches or open arms. They arrive with quiet hands, a steady presence, and the willingness to stay when everyone else has walked away. Clara didn't need saving in the way stories often promise. She didn't need a rescuer on a horse or vows whispered under starlight. She needed someone to stoke the fire, someone to make space at the table, someone to sharpen her knife, wrap her in wool, and say without words, "You are safe now." Elias had lost before, and instead of becoming cruel, he became careful. He didn't offer Clara comfort in the form of pretty words. He offered her warmth, silence, and a place to be human again. The truth is, love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the blanket folded at the foot of the bed. Sometimes it's a man building a cradle for a child he didn't know he'd call his. Sometimes it's choosing to light the fire again even when your hands still shake from the last time it burned you. This story reminds us, no matter how broken you feel, no matter who gave up on you, you are still worth choosing. And sometimes the person who finds you in your worst moment will become the one who helps you rewrite your life, not with promises, but with presence. Keep the fire. Tend to it. For someone. For yourself. Because healing doesn't start with noise. It starts with warmth. If this story stirred something quiet in your soul, if you've ever longed for warmth after the cold or a second chance after silence, then you belong here. At Frontier Reverie, we tell tales of broken hearts finding their way home in a wild, unforgiving world. Stories not just of the frontier, but of redemption love, without noise and family found in the most unexpected places. Subscribe, tap the bell, and join us by the fire. Because out here the stories may be wild, but the love is always real.